Are you doing rock, paper, scissors?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Rock, paper, scissors. Rock, paper, scissors.
Oh, yeah, you definitely played that.
Rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah, you definitely played that before.
Rock, paper, scissors.
Who'd you play rock, paper, scissors with?
Rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah, who'd you play with?
Rock, paper, scissors. Rock, paper, scissors. Rock, paper, scissors.
Did you learn from Mommy?
No.
Did you learn from Elijah?
No.
Did you learn
from
Did you learn from Sincere?
Sincere.
Oh, Sincere taught you?
Oh,
okay. All right. That's pretty cool. Okay. All right.
What's
Yeah, you don't need to do that. But you can talk to everybody, though. Welcome to the MasterMind Library. I am. They call me Ferdinand, the bringer of balance, leader of many disciplines, and one of your hosts of the MasterMind Library, the home of the MasterMind Book Club on FHTII.com. Thank y'all for being here today. And we're here today with my co-host, Trigger. How you doing, buddy?
Hi.
Saying hi to everybody out there? Yeah.
Nope, that's not.
And I'm sure they're saying hi right back to you.
No, outside in the door.
Yeah. Oh, they're outside. Say Elijah and Huey.
Tiger and Didi.
They're outside. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're inside for the MasterMind Library today.
Tiger, Huey.
Yes.
Didi.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. So today on episode 142 of the MasterMind Library, we're in
Mommy, Daddy, Tiger, Didi, Huey.
You see them on the periodic table over here?
The Herbal and
Okay. All right. Well, we're in chapter 1 of Secrets of the Federal Reserve today.
Let's go to David.
Yeah.
You know, hold the love of you.
We're gonna learn some good stuff, right?
The stuff is right here.
All right. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and move to where we need to be in the book, and then we'll make everything bigger on the screen, and we'll get started. Chapter 1 today is on Jekyll Island.
Okay. What did Jekyll Island?
Yep, Jekyll Island. Very good.
Yeah, that's you good.
Okay. All right. So let's get started. All right. The matter of a uniform discount rate was discussed and settled at Jekyll Island. Paul M. Warburg. On the night of November 22nd, 1910, a group of newspaper reporters stood disconsolately in the railway station at Hoboken, New Jersey. They had just watched a delegation of the nation's leading financiers leave the station on a secret mission. It would be years before they discovered what that mission was, and even then, they would not understand that the history of the United States underwent a drastic change after that night in Hoboken. The delegation had left in a sealed railway car with blinds drawn for an undisclosed destination. They were led by Senator Nelson Aldrich, head of the National Monetary Commission. President Theodore Roosevelt had signed into law the bill creating the National Monetary Commission in 1908. After the tragic Panic of 1907 had resulted in a public outcry that the nation's monetary system be stabilized. Aldrich had led the members of the commission on a 2-year tour of Europe, spending some $300,000 of public money. He had not yet made a report on the results of this trip, nor had he offered any plan for banking reform. Accompanying Senator Aldrich at the Hoboken station were his private secretary, Shelton, A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury and Special Assistant of the National Monetary Commission, Frank Vanderlip, President of the National City Bank of New York, Henry P. Davison, Senior Partner of the J.P. Morgan Company, and generally regarded as Morgan's personal emissary, and Charles D. Norton, president of the Morgan-dominated First National Bank of New York. Joining the group just before the train left the station were Benjamin Strong, also known as a lieutenant of J.P. Morgan, and Paul Warburg, a recent immigrant from Germany who had joined the banking house of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, New York, as a partner earning $500 a year. Six years later, a financier writer named Bertie Charles Forbes, who later founded the Forbes magazine, the present editor, Malcolm Forbes is his son, wrote, "Picture a party of the nation's greatest bankers stealing out of New York on a private railroad car under cover of darkness, stealthily highing hundreds of miles south, embarking on a mysterious launch, sneaking onto an island deserted by all but a few servants, leaving there a full week under such rigid secrecy that the names of not one of them was once mentioned, lest the servants learn the identity and disclose to the world this strangest, most secret expedition in the history of American finance. I am not romancing. I am giving to the world, for the first time, the real story of how the famous Aldrich currency report, the foundation of our new currency system, was written. The utmost secrecy was enjoined upon all. The public must not glean a hint of what was to be done. Senator Aldrich notified each one to go quietly into a private car of which the railroad had received orders to draw up on an unfrequented platform. Off the party set. New York's ubiquitous reporters had been foiled. Nelson Aldrich had confided to Henry, Frank, Paul, and Piat that he was to keep them locked up at Jekyll Island, out of the rest of the world, until they had evolved and compiled a scientific currency system for the United States, the real birth of the present Federal Reserve System. The plan done on Jekyll Island in the conference with Paul, Frank, and Henry. Warburg is the link that binds the Aldrich system and the present system together. He, more than anyone, has made the system possible as a working reality. The official biography of Senator Nelson Aldrich states, in the autumn of 1910, 6 men went out to shoot ducks. Aldrich, his secretary, Shelton, Andrews, Davison, Vanderlip, and Warburg. Reporters were waiting at the Brunswick, Georgia station. Mr. Davison went out and talked to them. The reporters dispersed, and the secret of the strange journey was not divulged. Mr. Aldrich asked him how he had managed it, and he did not volunteer the information. Davison had an excellent reputation as the person who could conciliate warring factions, a role he had performed for J.P. Morgan during the settling of the money panic of 1907. Another Morgan partner, T.W. Lamont, says, Henry P. Davison served as arbitrator of the Jekyll Island expedition. Let's see. Expedition. All right, so the way they've got this written, excuse me, it's a little strange to understand. Hold on, get some water. Excuse me.
Louder.
Oh, I don't know what that was. Ooh.
Daddy, you need the water. Daddy, you know what, Daddy?
I don't know where that came. Where that came. Ooh. Oh no! Stop. Oh, I gotta take a break real quick. Ooh. All right. I just need to stand up for a minute. You okay, buddy?
Daddy.
You all right, Trey? Okay. Well, let's try again. Oh, oh.
Daddy.
You need some water?
No, I need the side cup.
I'm gonna drink. You got the Spidey cup? Okay. Oh man, it was like something was in the air or something. Got me sweating and everything. Just came out of nowhere. Ooh. I don't know. It must have came up out of this bed or something. So I'll be all right. Ate some grapes.
Oh no, mommy.
All right, come on back, buddy. Ooh. Okay. All right, let's see. Where are we at? You know what? I'm going to just read all of this. From these references, it is possible to piece together the story. Aldrich's private car, which had left Hoboken Station with its shades drawn, had taken the financiers to Jekyll Island, Georgia. Some years earlier, a very exclusive group of millionaires, led by J.P. Morgan, had purchased the island as a winter retreat. They called themselves the Jekyll Island Hunt Club.
Thank you, Daddy.
Thank you, buddy.
Welcome.
And at first, the island was used only for hunting expeditions, until the millionaires realized that its pleasant climate offered
Thank you, Daddy.
a warm retreat from the rigors of winters in New York, and began to build splendid mansions, which they called cottages, for their families' winter vacations. The club building itself, being quite isolated, was sometimes in demand for stag parties and other pursuits unrelated to hunting. On such occasions, the club members who were not invited to these specific outings were asked not to appear there for a certain number of days. Before Nelson Aldrich's party had left New York, the club's members had been notified that the club would be occupied for the next 2 weeks. The Jekyll Island Club was chosen as the place to draft the plan for control of the money and credit of the people of the United States, not only because of its isolation, but also because it was the private preserve of the people who were drafting the plan. The New York Times later noted on May 3rd, 1931, in commenting on the death of George F. Baker, one of J.P. Morgan's closest associates, that Jekyll Island Club has lost one of its most distinguished members. 1/6 of the total wealth of the world was represented by the members of the Jekyll Island Club. Membership was by inheritance only. The Aldrich group had no interest in hunting. Jekyll Island was chosen for the site of the preparation of the central bank because it offered complete privacy and because there was not a journalist within 50 miles. Such was the need for secrecy that the members of the party agreed before arriving at Jekyll Island that no last names will be used at any time during their 2-week stay. The group later referred to themselves as the First Name Club, as the last names of Warburg, Strong, Vanderlip, and the others were prohibited during their stay. The customary attendants had been given 2-week vacations from the club, and new servants brought in from the mainland for this occasion who did not know the names of any of those present. Even if they had been interrogated after the Aldrich party went back to New York, they could not have given the names. This arrangement proved to be so satisfactory that the members, limited to those who had actually been present at Jekyll Island, later had a number of informal get-togethers in New York. What's up, buddy? What? I don't know what you want. Why all this secrecy? Why this 1,000-mile trip in a closed railway car to a remote hunting club? Ostensibly, it was to carry out a program of public service, to prepare banking reform, which would be a boon to the people of the United States, which had been ordered by the National Monetary Commission. The participants were no strangers to public benefactions. Usually, their names were inscribed on brass plaques or on the exteriors of buildings which they had donated. This was not the procedure which they followed at Jekyll Island. No brass plaque was ever erected to mark the selfless actions of those who met at their private hunt club in 1910 to improve the lot of every citizen of the United States. In fact, no benefaction took place at Jekyll Island. The Aldrich Group journeyed there in private to write the banking and currency legislation which the National Monetary Commission had been ordered to prepare in public. At stake was the future control of the money and credit of the United States. If any genuine monetary reform had been prepared and presented to Congress, it would have ended the power excuse me, of the elitist one world money creators. Jekyll Island ensured that a central bank would be established in the United States, which would give these bankers everything they had always wanted. As the most technically proficient of those present, Paul Warburg was charged with doing most of the drafting of the plan. His work would then be discussed and gone over by the rest of the group. Senator Nelson Aldrich was there to see that the completed plan would come out in a form which he could get passed by Congress, and the other bankers were there to include whatever details would be needed to be certain that they got everything they wanted. In a finished draft composed during a one-time stay, after they returned to New York, there could be no second get-together to rework their plan. They could not hope to obtain such secrecy for their work on a second journey. The Jekyll Island group remained at the club for 9 days, working furiously to complete their task. Despite the common interests of those present, the work did not proceed without friction. Senator Aldrich, always a domineering person, considered himself the chosen leader of the group and could not help ordering everyone else about. Aldrich also felt somewhat out of place as the only member who was not a professional banker. He had had substantial banking interests throughout his career, but only as a person who profited from his ownership of bank stock. He knew little about the technical aspects of financial operations. His opposite number, Paul Warburg, believed that every question raised by the group demanded not merely an answer, but a lecture. He rarely lost an opportunity to give the members a long discourse designed to impress them with the extent of his knowledge of banking. This was resented by the others and often drew barbed remarks from Aldrich. The national diplomacy of Henry P. Davison proved to be the catalyst which kept them at their work. Warburg's thick alien accent grated on them, and constantly reminded them that they had to accept his presence if a central bank plan was to be devised, which would guarantee them their profits. Warburg made little effort to smooth over their prejudices and contested them on every possible occasion on technical banking questions, which he considered his private preserve. In all conspiracies, there must be great secrecy. The monetary reform plan prepared at Jekyll Island was to be presented to Congress as the completed work of the National Monetary Commission. It was imperative that the real authors of the bill remain hidden. So great was popular resentment against bankers since the panic of 1907 that no congressman would dare to vote for a bill bearing the Wall Street taint, no matter who had contributed to his campaign expenses. The Jekyll Island plan was a central bank plan, and in this country, there was a long tradition of struggle against inflicting a central bank on the American people. It had begun with Thomas Jefferson's fight against Alexander Hamilton's scheme for the first Bank of the United States, backed by James Rothschild. It had continued with President Andrew Jackson's successful war against Alexander Hamilton's scheme for the second Bank of the United States, in which Nicholas Biddle was acting as the agent for James Rothschild of Paris. The result of that struggle was the creation of the independent sub-treasury system, which supposedly has served to keep the funds of the United States out of the hands of the financiers. A study of the panics of 1873, 1893, and 1907 indicates that these panics were the result of the international bankers' operation in London. The public was demanding in 1908 that Congress enact legislation to prevent the recurrence of artificially induced money panics. Such monetary reform now seemed inevitable. It was to head off and control such reform that the National Monetary Commission had been set up with Nelson Aldrich at its head, since he was majority leader of the Senate. The main problem, as Paul Warburg informed his colleagues, was to avoid the name central bank. For that reason, he had decided upon the designation of Federal Reserve System. This would deceive the people into thinking it was not a central bank. However, the Jekyll Island plan would be a central bank plan, fulfilling the main functions of a central bank. It would be owned by private individuals who would profit from ownership of shares. As a bank of issue, it would control the nation's money and credit. In the chapter on Jekyll Island in his biography of Aldrich, Stevenson writes of the conference. How was the Reserve Bank to be controlled? It must be controlled by Congress. The government was to be represented in the board of directors. It was to have full knowledge of all the bank's affairs, but a majority of the directors were to be chosen directly or indirectly by the banks of the association. Thus, the proposed Federal Reserve Bank was to be controlled by Congress and answerable to the government, but the majority of the directors were to be chosen, directly or indirectly, by the banks of the association. In the final refinement of Warburg's plan, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors would be appointed by the President of the United States, but the real work of the board would be controlled by a Federal Advisory Council, meeting with the governors. The council would be chosen by the directors of the 12 Federal Reserve banks and would remain unknown to the public. The next consideration was to conceal the fact that the proposed Federal Reserve System would be dominated by the masters of the New York money market. The congressmen from the South and the West could not survive if they voted for a Wall Street plan. Farmers and small businessmen in those areas had suffered most from the money panics. There had been great popular resentment against the Eastern bankers, which during the 19th century became a political movement known as populism. The private papers of Nicholas Biddle, not released until more than a century after his death, show that quite early on the Eastern bankers were fully aware of the widespread public opposition to them. Paul Warburg advanced at Jekyll Island the primary deception which would prevent the citizens from recognizing that his plan set up a central bank. This was the regional reserve system. He proposed a system of 4, later 12, branch reserve banks located in different sections of the country. Few people outside the banking world would realize that the existing concentration of the nation's money and credit structure in New York made the proposal of a regional reserve system a delusion. Another proposal advanced by Paul Warburg at Jekyll Island was the manner of selection of administrators for the proposed regional reserve system. Senator Nelson Aldrich had insisted that the officials should be appointive, not elected, and that Congress should have no role in their selection. His Capitol Hill experience had taught him that congressional opinion would often be inimical to the Wall Street interests, as congressmen from the West and South might wish to demonstrate to their constituents that they were protecting them against the Eastern bankers. Warburg responded that the administrators of the proposed central banks should be subject to executive approval by the president. This patent removal of the system from congressional control meant that the Federal Reserve proposal was unconstitutional from its inception because the Federal Reserve System was to be a bank of issue. Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 5 of the Constitution expressly charges Congress with the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. Warburg's plan would deprive Congress of its sovereignty, and the systems of checks and balances of power set up by Thomas Jefferson in the Constitution would now be destroyed. Administrators of the proposed system would control the nation's money and credit, and would themselves be approved by the executive department of the government. The judicial department, the Supreme Court, etc., was already virtually controlled by the executive department through presidential appointment to the bench. Paul Warburg later wrote a massive exposition of his plan, the Federal Reserve System, its origin and growth, 7 of some 1,750 pages, but the name Jekyll Island appears nowhere in this text. He does state, Volume 1, page 58, but then the conference closed. After a week of earnest deliberation, the rough draft of what later became the Aldrich Bill had been agreed upon, and a plan had been outlined which provided for a National Reserve Association, meaning a central reserve organization with an elastic note issue based on gold and commercial paper. On page 60, Warburg writes, the results of the conference were entirely confidential. Even the fact there had been a meeting was not permitted to become public. He adds in a footnote, though 18 sick years have since gone by, I do not feel free to give a description of this most interesting conference concerning which Senator Aldrich pledged all participants to secrecy. B.C. Forbes, Revelation 8 of the secret expedition to Jekyll Island had surprisingly little impact. It did not appear in print until 2 years after the Federal Reserve Act had been passed by Congress. Hence, it was never read during the period when it could have had an effect. That is, during the congressional debate on the bill. Forbes' story was also dismissed by those in the know as preposterous and a mere invention. Stevenson mentions this on page 484 of his book about Aldrich. This curious episode of Jekyll Island has been generally regarded as a myth. B.C. Forbes got some information from one of the reporters. It told in vague outline the Jekyll Island story, but made no impression and was generally regarded as a mere yarn. The cover-up of the Jekyll Island conference proceeded along 2 lines, both of which were successful. The first, as Stevenson mentions, was to dismiss the entire story as a romantic concoction which never actually took place. Although there were brief references to Jekyll Island in later books concerning the Federal Reserve System, these also attracted little public attention, as we have noted. Warburg's massive and supposedly definite work on the Federal Reserve System does not mention Jekyll Island at all, although he does admit that a conference took place. In none of his voluminous speeches or writings do the words Jekyll Island appear, with a single notable exception. He agreed to Professor Stevenson's request that he prepare a brief statement for the Aldrich biography. This appears on page 485 as part of the Warburg memorandum. In this excerpt, Warburg writes, the matter of a uniform discount rate was discussed and settled at Jekyll Island. Another member of the First Name Club was less reticent. Frank Vanderlip later published a few brief references to the conference. In the Saturday Evening Post, February 9, 1935, page 25, Vanderlip wrote, despite my views about the value to society of greater publicity for the affairs of corporations, there was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. since it would have been fatal to Senator Aldrich's plan to have it known that he was calling on anybody from Wall Street to help him in preparing his bill, precautions were taken that would have delighted the heart of James Stillman, a colorful and secretive banker who was president of the National City Bank during the Spanish-American War, and who was thought to have been involved in getting us into that war. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. In a travel feature in the Washington Post, March 27, 1983, Follow the Rich to Jekyll Island, Roy Hoops writes. In 1910, when Aldrich and four financial experts wanted a place to meet in secret to reform the country's banking system, they faked a hunting trip to Jekyll and for 10 days holed up in the clubhouse, where they made plans for what eventually would become the Federal Reserve Bank. Nathaniel Vanderlip wrote in his autobiography, From Farm Boy to Financier, our secret expedition to Jekyll Island was the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. The essential points of the Aldrich Plan were all contained in the Federal Reserve Act as it was passed. Professor E.R.A. Seligman, a member of the international banking family of J. and W. Seligman, and head of the Department of Economics at Columbia University, wrote in an essay published by the Academy of Political Science, Proceedings, V4, number 4, page 387 through page 390. It is known to a very few how great is the indebtedness of the United States to Mr. Warburg, for it may be said without fear of contradiction that in its fundamental features, the Federal Reserve Act is the work of Mr. Warburg more than any other man in the country. The existence of a Federal Reserve Board creates, in everything but in name, a real central bank. In the two fundamentals of command of reserves and of a discount policy, the Federal Reserve Act has frankly accepted the principle of the Aldrich Bill. And these principles, as has been stated, were the creation of Mr. Warburg and Mr. Warburg alone. It must not be forgotten that Mr. Warburg had a practical object in view in formulating his plans and in advancing them, slightly varying suggestions from time to time. It was incumbent on him to remember that the education of the country must be gradual, and that a large part of the task was to break down prejudices and remove suspicion. His plans, therefore, contain all sorts of elaborate suggestions designed to guard the public against fancied dangers and to persuade the country that the general scheme was at all practicable. It was the hope of Mr. Warburg that with the lapse of time, it might be possible to eliminate from the law a few clauses which were inserted largely at his suggestion for educational purposes. Now that the public debt of the United States has passed $1 trillion, we may indeed admit how great is the indebtedness of the United States to Mr. Warburg. At the time he wrote the Federal Reserve Act, the public debt was almost non-existent. Professor Seligman points out Warburg's remarkable prescience that the real task of the members of the Jekyll Island Conference was to prepare a banking plan which would gradually educate the country and break down prejudices and remove suspicion. The campaign to enact the plan into law succeeded in doing just that. And that concludes Chapter 1 of Jekyll Island. On our next episode, we'll be coming back with Chapter 2 on, page 25, Chapter 2 on the Aldrich Plan. Hey, this is some powerful stuff right here, y'all. Learning about how money has been moving. This is happened a long time ago, but it's happening right now, and it happened hundreds of years ago, and it happened thousands of years ago, and it's happened over and over again. And understanding each of these cycles and each of these stories helps us to be in a position where we can do better in the future, right? But we got to know where we come from to achieve that. We got to understand financial literacy. We got to understand who's making certain decisions and how we're participating, right? Well, y'all be blessed. Y'all take care and expose your gift.